You're listening to the Quince podcast.
In a significant move on 15 September, the centre topped up the telcos by providing a 4-year moratorium on their due payment as part of its latest reforms. The move comes as a big relief to the financially starved industry, especially to Vodafone Idea and Bharti Airtel, which are two of the hardest hit telcos. In short, these reforms provide the telcos 4 more years to pay their adjusted gross revenue (AGR) and spectrum dues, and will kick in from 1st October. While the telcos will also have to pay interest on the 4-year deferral of payments, they have the option to convert the due amount into equity at the end of the 4 years. But even though many experts have welcomed the reforms, the question which still looms in the air is if this is enough to help Vodafone Idea survive, which just 6 weeks ago was on the brink of collapse due to the burden of its exposure to the market. To understand the reforms introduced and how realistic their impact will be on telcos like Vodafone Idea, we spoke to former Bharti Airtel CEO Sanjay Kapoor. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. The telecom sector reform announcements sent a new burst of energy to the stock markets as shares of both Vodafone Idea and Bharti Airtel rallied on 16 September. Along with the 4-year moratorium period, the other significant reform was the centre finally climbing down on its earlier definition of AGR and recognized the telcos version of it. The telcos for nearly 15 years have argued that AGR should only be limited to revenue that they have earned from telecom services and not non-telecom services. The centre has argued against this and even took it up at the Supreme Court, where it won the long-drawn battle against Vodafone Idea, Bharti Airtel and Tata Teleservices. Now, for the uninitiated, the AGR issue arose when the centre in the late 90s introduced a commercial revenue sharing model with the telcos, and the telcos had an option to pay the centre's steep licensing fees and spectrum usage charges via a portion of the AGR. And how the AGR was defined was the bane of the decade-long contention. Redefining AGR and a moratorium period come as a saving grace for Vodafone Idea, which has an AGR liability of Rs 58,254 crore. Including this, the telco also reportedly has a financial exposure of Rs 1.8 lakh crore as of March 2021. The reforms also come just 6 weeks after Kumar Mangalam Birla stepped down as Vodafone CEO and even reportedly offered his share of the company to the centre to keep the company afloat. But with a market share of only 23.59%, according to a Telecom Regulatory Authority of India report, will the moratorium period help Vodafone Idea survive? Sanjay Kapoor believes that given Vodafone Idea's financial exposure and EBITDAs, which is a measure of a company's performance, no matter the moratorium period, it is unlikely that the telco will come out profitable at the end of 4 years.
I was reading some reports, and one of the reports said that this moratorium will reduce the payment burden for VIL by about Rs 250 billion per annum, right? Which is quite a bit. However, when you look at Voda Idea's EBITDAs, which are close to about Rs 55 billion, they fall short to cover up their capex, their payables, both to government and others. They have to still repay the NCDs. They have to renew bank guarantees worth almost 120 billion in the near future, right? So no matter what, even with this moratorium, and then looming large is the need to migrate their customers to 5G. Will they be able to make their ends be met by all this and also be able to invest more in 5G tomorrow? I think that equation is not getting balanced, at least in my mind. I see a big deficit on that.
As Mr. Kapoor said, that there is a big deficit when it comes to market realities and the prospective reforms that the centre has introduced to help sustain telcos. Now, one of the core ways that telcos in India raise revenue is through raising tariffs on their products, like our prepaid or postpaid plans. And tariff hikes by telcos are imminent, according to several news reports in the past few months. CNBC, just at the start of September 2021, reported that Bharti Airtel hinted at an increase in tariffs as of recently announced fundraising plans. And the Economic Times in July reported that Vodafone Idea will also be following Airtel and discontinuing some plans and increase tariffs on their popular plans. So, will an increase in tariffs and the savings which comes from the 4-year moratorium period help Vodafone Idea build its capacity and remain competitive? Sanjay Kapoor says that Vodafone Idea may not be able to hike tariffs to such an extent where it can still remain competitive with other giants like Jio and Airtel. According to him, the telco at best is a distant third player in the market, and competing for the pole position is a pipe dream.
It's a continuum, and let's talk about both ends of the continuum, right? If I take a rather pessimistic view, then I will end up saying that Voda, because it will not be competitive, because it may not be in a position to raise the tariffs so high, and the fact that they will have to accrue the interest, and finally it will impact their P&L and balance sheet both, and at some stage the reality will hit them, and if that happens, then Voda will have to wind off. They will not be able to continue business at one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, to say, okay, they'll continue, they'll manage somehow and sustain themselves and probably stay in the market and not reach a stage of closure because of what has happened. On that, I have two observations. One, you never have a business funded only for sustenance. The moment you fund a business for sustenance, you go down the tube, right? Nobody can stay still in water. You have to do something in the water to stay afloat, right? And that will become a problem. And even if they survive, for me, they will be a distant third player. And them to be competitive versus Jio or be competitive against Airtel and really offer customer experience which competes with these two leading players is a pipe dream. I don't see that happening. I really will be surprised and proved wrong if that was to happen and they were to come up and actually try and garner a number 2 or number 1 position back again, or give them any sort of challenge. So at best they'll be a distant third player, and in the worst scenario, they'll have to call it quits.
He adds that Vodafone Idea will always remain a weak third player in the sector, and what is haunting its growth is its financial past.
From a market impact perspective or government policy perspective, there'll be a weak third player whose voice will always be feebler than the voice of the leading two players. But you have to also keep in mind that there's a large ecosystem around in telecom. So there are content providers, there are device providers, there are security providers, there are cloud operators, and in future, many digital service operators. And the tower and infrastructure business that leans on these operators. Now, those ecosystem partners have built their business cases based on an oligopoly, right? A competition amongst a few, right? And for them, it's important for Voda to survive, even if he's a number 3 player or a distant player. Because no matter how weak he is, he needs towers, he needs in building, he will need probably a little lesser, but he needs all those things to survive. And therefore, there's business case. Tomorrow, if this one guy was to be eliminated, then their entire business model has to move from an oligopoly to a duopoly, which will pose in different challenges of inflation straight away, right? Because their business cases today rests on a very different economics. So I think Voda is important, even as a distant third player. The worst thing would be if this converts into a duopoly. And like you rightly said, it is not contingent to these measures because these measures are prospective in nature. Voda's past is hounding them. And that past is not going to be sorted out till they raise tariffs and the customer accepts those tariffs. Don't forget that they have been losing their customers to operators. The only customer base, according to me, which is a little fortified for Voda, is their postpaid base, right? But postpaid doesn't contribute to 80% of their revenues. It probably contributes to maybe 30% of their revenues. So that's fortified. But the prepaid base is very vulnerable. And in future, the 2G base will be completely vulnerable. And they have the highest chunk of that. 3G is going to be shut. It's shut for all practical purposes. So Voda is vulnerable on the prepaid front and Voda is vulnerable on the 2G front completely because their ability to move into 5G is the weakest compared to all three operators.
Though the reforms come as a major relief to the telcos, some experts have noted that these should have been introduced a long time ago. Speaking to Bloomberg Quint, former Telecom Secretary R. Chandrasekhar said that the measure such as AGR calculation has been a quote-unquote very obvious measure for years now. and that it quote-unquote made no sense to continue with it. Mahesh Uppal, a telecom policy analyst, says that the moratorium period is not long enough and doubts how sufficient it will be for telcos such as Vodafone Idea. So, what could have been other possible measures that the centre could have introduced to help keep the struggling telecom industry afloat? Sanjay Kapoor weighs in.
The problem is very simple. The problem is of the past, and unless and until we address the past, there can't be a guarantee to Voda's survival in future, right? And for that, the the real problem was that one end Voda claims that there were mathematical errors in calculations. Now, to my mind, simplest thing for anybody is to say, okay, we'll give you benefit of doubt of any mathematical errors. We don't want to make money on count of any mathematical errors that have been committed. So that could have probably been actioned by the government and said, okay, we'll give you. And if they are right, they would have got the benefit. If they were wrong, anyway, the government wouldn't have lost anything. So that was one step possible. The next step was simply that 70% of what they have to pay is about interest and penalties. Could penalties, if penalties are being waived for future, could they have been waived in the past, right? For the past period, or made lesser onerous on Voda Idea, and that would have helped Airtel as well. But that didn't happen. And then I finally said that one way was to actually convert the debt into equity for the government and the banks. That was the boldest step that the government could have taken, and sat as a custodian on that to make sure that you dress up the bride and then pass it on to the new match that you find for the bride, and that would have happened over time. But that really required something out of the box that government would have never done earlier. These are the things. And like right now we are saying, even going forward, if for Voda's ability to move into 5G is not easy. So with 5G, license fee cut and SUC cut, the benefit will go to Airtel and benefit will go to Jio. But the benefit may not go to Voda at all. So Voda is going to miss out on this license fee and SUC. And their competitiveness and if they don't migrate to 5G is going to be even more impacted versus these two operators. So I think those are the sort of things that could have done. But I know governments have their own constraints. It's not easy. We all can comment from outside, but from a logical standpoint, these are the things that I think could have really helped them to be there. And I still believe there would not have been a very close number 3, but that would have given them a fair chance to continue.
Another key takeaway from the reforms was the auction of 5G spectrum next year, which has been long awaited and is also a survival mechanism for companies like Vodafone Idea. Now, 5G technology, which is the next generation telecom network, has been deployed in other countries like the US in a limited stage. But for India, it is only a distant future, according to a parliamentary report from February 2021. The Parliamentary Committee of IT in February had ripped the Communications Ministry for its quote-unquote laid-back, insufficient and unprepared efforts for deployment of 5G in India. In our previous episodes, we have done a deep dive on India's 5G preparedness, and you can find a link to them in our show notes. And a looming issue of 5G in India is the unit price of spectrum, which compared to other countries is 3 to 70 times more in India. And as we stated earlier, one of the ways that telcos raise revenue is through tariff hikes. Sanjay Kapoor believes that competing in the 5G auction is essential for companies like Vodafone Idea to survive in the industry, given its low market share in the 2G, 3G and 4G consumer base.
I think we are somewhere close to that. So first of all, sometimes I get disappointed that why are some moves not being made? For the industry to make a move in unison might be very tough now because of the depleted position of Voda Idea and BSNL, MTNL. They are not really competing. So the only two eligible bachelors to raise prices in the market are either Jio or Airtel, right? Airtel to me is the most eligible bachelor. They are the best poised for a simple reason that over time, as they have improved their competitiveness versus Jio and market share, I think they have demonstrated that their postpaid base is not vulnerable. They have fortified their postpaid base. And also the high-end customers are attracted to the brand and stick to the brand. So they've not really lost. Jio probably has grown more at the cost of other operators than at the cost of Airtel. So I think Airtel is very well poised to increase prices rather than only small tinkerings that they've done in the recent past. Why they haven't, I'm a bit surprised. And for Jio, they have really, this is one unique case in the whole world where a person from nowhere came and occupied the number one chair in the market. I mean, they had the pole position, they have the pole position. The issue is, now when is the time for them to move the game from being the best price player in the market to be the best experience driver in the market? And the moment they take the position of we drive the best experience in the market, then the natural next step is to raise tariffs, to say we give you value for what you get, and the value comes from the quality of service that we get. So I think it's either Jio or Airtel. Airtel can do it because they have the legacy and the benefit of their postpaid base, and that segment is not very sensitive to price. At the end of the day, guys like me were paying a 5,000 rupee bill. Why am I paying only 500 rupees now? Right? You think I'll even blink an eyelid if this was to go up by 100%? I will not. And there are many others in the postpaid segment who are probably in the same category. So I think either one of the two. Voda now, yes, Voda will have to raise prices because it's a matter of survival for them. And postpaid is a safe ground for them also. I think they have loyalty with the postpaid customers, not as much as Airtel, but definitely they've not lost many of their postpaid customers going across to Jio. And survival, man, it's better to be small but profitable is what is the mantra for Voda Idea. They can't take a position to say we are going to be challenging Jio and Airtel. I think that ain't happening.
The reforms have certainly kicked the can of the telcos' worry 4 years down the road, but it remains to be seen if the sector will continue as an oligopoly with Vodafone India in the mix or a duopoly. If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.